He was a man of explosive rage and fragile vanity who ruled France through psychological violence. Nicolas Sarkozy is the most divisive figure of the 21st century, a hyper-president, fueled by a toxic mix of ego and corruption. Accused of buying his throne with Gaddafi's blood money only to tear the nation apart. This is the anatomy of his self-destruction. The collapse of the man who once held the fate of Europe in his hands did not begin in the gilded corridors of the Élysée Palace. It began in the dust of a broken family, in the shadow of a father present only in his cruelty. Nicolas Sarkozy's life is a psychological tragedy about the desperate, unending search for validation, starting in the gray post-war gloom of the mid-1950s Paris. In the gray post-war gloom of the mid-1950s, where a boy was born into a fault line of class and identity that would define his entire existence. Nicolas Sarkozy was born on January 28, 1955. On paper, his lineage suggests a life of aristocratic ease. His father, Paul Sarkozy de Nagy was a Hungarian nobleman, a refugee who fled the Soviet tanks in 1944. Paul was a figure cut from the cloth of a darker, older Europe, a minor aristocrat with a major sense of entitlement, a man who viewed life as a buffet to be consumed without paying the bill. He arrived in Paris charming, penniless, and utterly devoid of the bourgeois morality that governed the city. He married André Mallat, the daughter of a reputable doctor from the Jewish quarter of Thessaloniki. It was a union of opposites, the flamboyant, irresponsible adventurer and the grounded, serious woman of duty. It was a collision that would produce a volatile energy in their second son. The defining trauma of Nicolas Sarkozy's life occurred in 1959. He was 4 years old. Paul Sarkozy packed his bags and left. He didn't just leave the house. He defected from the family unit entirely. He moved on to other women, other lives, and eventually other marriages. But he didn't disappear. He remained a satellite in Nicolas's life, visible, glittering, but cold and unreachable. The abandonment was financial as well as emotional. Paul refused to pay alimony, famously telling André that working would build her character, while he lived the life of a playboy in a studio in the wealthy suburbs. This left Nicolas and his brothers to be raised in the home of their grandfather, Benedict Mallat. This left Nicolas raised in the home of his grandfather in Neuilly-sur-Seine. Neuilly was not merely a suburb, it was a fortress of privilege, a sanctuary for old money and industrial titans. It is the sanctuary of old money, Catholic aristocracy, and industrial titans. To be poor in Neuilly is a specific kind of torture. It is to be constantly pressed against the glass of a candy store. You are forbidden to enter. Nicolas was the little Hungarian. That was the phrase whispered in the schoolyard. He was short. He was foreign. His name, Sarkozy de Nagy, was a mouthful of jagged consonants in a world of smooth French vowels. In a school system dominated by tall, blonde, athletic boys from stable Catholic families, Nicolas was the son of the abandoned wife. He wore clothes that were well cared for, but clearly not new. He felt the sting of charity every day. The psychologists call this the outsider complex. But in Sarkozy's case, it was fused with a burning radioactive shame. He didn't want to be accepted by the establishment. He wanted to force them to kneel. Decades later, he would confess that he was the sum of all humiliation suffered during childhood. It was a social emotion requiring an audience. And for young Nicolas, the audience was the elite of France. He looked at the tall, confident boys in the playground, and he made a silent vow. He would beat them. He would outwork them. He would outshout them. If he couldn't be one of them, he would become their master. His grandfather, Benedict Mala, was a Gaullist, a fervent believer in General de Gaulle. He instilled in Nicolas a love for France, but it was a specific kind of France, orderly, strong, hierarchical. Yet the ghost of Paul Sarkozy haunted every dinner table conversation. On the rare occasions Paul visited, he was cutting. He would look at Nicolas, who was struggling in school, and deliver verdicts that sounded like curses. He reportedly told his son, "With your name and your grades, you will never succeed in France. You should move to the United States. France is for the elite, and you are not it." Instead of collapsing or rebelling, Nicolas internalized the aggression. A different spirit might have rebelled against the system entirely, becoming a revolutionary or an artist. Nicolas Sarkozy did neither. He internalized the aggression. He decided to prove the father wrong by conquering the very system the father claimed was closed to him. This is the engine of his ambition. It is not a desire to do good. It is a desire for revenge. He was a mediocre student. He failed his baccalaureate on the first try. He wasn't intellectual. He didn't read poetry. He didn't care about philosophy. While the French political elite was being groomed in the prestigious ENA, École Nationale d'Administration, reciting Latin and studying Marx, Sarkozy was studying the street. He realized early on that he had a gift. It wasn't intelligence in the academic sense. It was a feral, kinetic energy. He could speak. He could talk until the air left the room. He could persuade. He discovered that in a room full of hesitant intellectuals, the man who speaks with absolute conviction, even if he is wrong, becomes the leader. He joined the Gaullist Party, the UDR, in 1974. He was 19 years old. The party was a dinosaur at the time, filled with aging resistance fighters and stuffy notables who smelled of stale tobacco and the past. Sarkozy hit them like an electric shock. He was relentless. He volunteered for everything. He put up posters at 3 a.m. in the rain. He organized meetings. He carried the bags of the powerful. He had no fixed ideology, only a belief in movement, action, and winning. Sarkozy's only belief was movement, action, winning. He chose the right because that's where the power was in Neuilly. If Neuilly had been a communist stronghold, Nicolas Sarkozy would have been a commissar. By 1976, at age 21, he was a municipal councillor, but he was watching. He was learning the art of political patricide, the killing of the father. His mentor was Achille Peretti, the mayor of Neuilly. Peretti was a heavy hitter, the president of the National Assembly, a chaotic Corsican giant. He treated Nicolas like a mascot, the little one. Sarkozy played the role perfectly. He was the loyal lapdog, the energetic assistant, the young man who was always there to pour the water and clap the loudest. But the dog was waiting for the master to falter. The moment arrived in 1983. Achille Peretti died of a heart attack. The throne of Neuilly was empty. In the feudal system of French politics, the succession was supposed to be orderly. The godfather of the right, Charles Pasqua, a man who looked and acted like a character from a Melville gangster film, decided he wanted the seat. Pasqua was terrifying. He was the future minister of the interior, a man who knew where all the bodies were buried. He assumed the little Nicolas would step aside, perhaps fetch him coffee, and wait 20 years for his turn. Sarkozy did the unthinkable. He realized that Pasqua was currently in the hospital for a hernia operation. While the lion was sedated, the fox went to work. Sarkozy spent 48 hours without sleep. He visited every single municipal councillor in Neuilly. He charmed them. He threatened them. He cajoled them. He played on their local pride. Why let an outsider like Pasqua take over our Neuilly? Why not choose the young, energetic boy who grew up on these streets? When Pasqua woke up from anesthesia, It was too late. The vote had been held. Nicolas Sarkozy, age 28, was the mayor of Neuilly-sur-Seine. The betrayal was breathtaking. He had stabbed the most dangerous man in France in the back, and he had won. This victory taught him a lesson that would eventually destroy him. Audacity has no price if you win. He learned that rules are for the timid. He learned that if you move fast enough, you can steal the crown before anyone realizes it's gone. He was now the Prince of Neuilly. He had the office, he had the title, but he still didn't have the stature. He was still the short guy in the big chair. He needed a stage larger than a town council meeting. He needed a spectacle to validate his existence. 10 years later, in 1993, fate handed him a tragedy, and he turned it into a one-man show. On May 13th, 1993, terror struck his fiefdom. A man named Eric Schmidt, mentally unstable and desperate, walked into the Commandant Charcot nursery school in Neuilly. He was strapped with explosives. He took 21 children and their teacher hostage. He demanded a ransom. He called himself HB, Human Bomb. The situation was a nightmare. The raid, elite police unit, surrounded the building. Snipers were positioned on the rooftops. The protocol was clear. Politicians stay back. Negotiators do the talking. The situation is volatile. One wrong word, and the school turns into a crater. But Nicolas Sarkozy saw the cameras. The entire French press corps was camped outside. CNN was there. This was a global event. Sarkozy ignored the police protocol. He asserted his authority as mayor and minister of the budget. He demanded to go in. A secure politician lets professionals handle a crisis. A narcissist sees a mirror. Sarkozy believed that his personal charisma, his sheer force of will, was powerful enough to defuse a bomb. It was a staggering act of hubris. He put on a firefighter's jacket, a costume essentially, and walked into the classroom. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sweat and fear. The human bomb was agitated, his finger hovering near the detonator. Sarkozy began to talk. He negotiated. He used his hands, his eyes locked on the madman. He managed to convince Schmidt to release some of the children. The image of Nicolas Sarkozy emerging from the school, carrying a child in his arms, his face a mask of exhausted determination, was beamed into millions of living rooms. It was the perfect shot. It was cinematic. It was heroic. And it was deeply calculated. Later, police officers would grumble. They argued that Sarkozy's presence agitated the hostage taker and complicated the tactical solution. They argued that he risked the children's lives for a photo op. But the public didn't hear the police. They saw the hero. The crisis ended violently. The police drugged Schmidt's coffee, waited for him to doze off, and then shot him dead while he slept. The danger was over. But a new danger had been born, the Sarkozy myth. He had tasted the drug of mass adulation. He realized that governing was boring, but crisis management was exhilarating. He began to crave the adrenaline of the emergency. If there wasn't a crisis, he would create one. He was becoming a junkie for the breaking news banner. But hubris is a boomerang. It always returns to strike the thrower. The year is 1995. The presidency of François Mitterrand is ending. The right is poised to retake the Élysée. The natural candidate is Jacques Chirac. Chirac was Sarkozy's political father. He had attended Sarkozy's first wedding. He had nurtured him. He called him my son. But there was a rival, Edouard Balladur, the prime minister. Balladur was everything Sarkozy was not. Tall, aristocratic, wealthy, smooth. The polls showed Balladur winning in a landslide. The elite flocked to him. Sarkozy had a choice: loyalty to the father who raised him, Chirac, or betrayal for the stepfather who promised him power, Balladur. Sarkozy looked at the polls. He looked at the momentum, and he made the calculation of the sociopath. Feelings are irrelevant. Winning is everything. He defected. He became Balladour's spokesman. He attacked Chirac with a viciousness that shocked even the cynical French press. He mocked Chirac's mannerisms, his old-fashioned style. He was the Brutus to Chirac's Caesar. But then the impossible happened. The French public, sensing Balladour's arrogance, turned on him. Chirac, the wounded lion, campaigned with the energy of desperation. He connected with the people. May 1995, Jacques Chirac is elected president. Edouard Balladour is crushed, and Nicolas Sarkozy is a dead man walking. The years from 1995 to 2002 were Sarkozy's crossing of the desert. He was banished. He was hated by the new president. He was booed by his own party. The public saw him as a treacherous opportunist. This is the crucible. Most politicians would have faded away, taking a comfortable job on a corporate board. But this is where the primal wound took over. Remember the boy in the playground? The boy who was told he would never succeed? Failure was not an option because failure meant his father was right. Sarkozy didn't retreat. He hardened. He shed the last vestiges of youthful idealism. He realized that in France, you are not loved for being nice. You are respected for being strong. And if you cannot be loved, you must be feared. He began to rebuild brick by brick. He changed his style. He became more aggressive, more populist. He stopped trying to please the elites who had rejected him anyway, and started talking directly to the anxieties of the working class. He talked about crime. He talked about immigration. He talked about the decline of France. He was tapping into a dark vein in the national psyche. He realized that the French were scared of globalization, scared of losing their identity, scared of the violence in the suburbs. And he offered himself as the cure. He waited. He plotted. And in 2002, when Jacques Chirac won re-election against the far-right Jean-Marie Le Pen, Chirac had no choice. The right was fractured. He needed a pit bull to keep the order. He needed someone to do the dirty work that the aristocrats didn't want to touch. The one person who could temper his impulses and smooth his rough edges. Yet she despised the very spotlight he craved. She had left him once before, in 2005, for an affair in New York. And though Sarkozy had humiliated himself to beg her back for the campaign, her return had been a performance. Now, having delivered him to the steps of the Élysée Palace, she was checking out. The irony was suffocating. Sarkozy had conquered the highest office in the land to impress the one person who no longer cared. This emotional vacuum created the hyper-president, a leader who tried to fill the silence of his personal life with the noise of constant political motion. Sarkozy was everywhere at once, announcing a new reform every morning, visiting factories, hospitals, and police stations in a whirlwind of activity that left his ministers and the public exhausted. He blurred the lines between his private turmoil and the state, treating the presidency like a reality television show where he was the star, the director, and the producer. When he met Carla Bruni, the Italian supermodel and singer, in late 2007, he did not keep the romance discreet as French tradition demanded. He paraded her through Disneyland Paris in front of the paparazzi, turning his courtship into a public spectacle. He held a press conference, a ritual usually reserved for grave geopolitical matters, and told journalists with a grin, "With Carla, it's serious." The public watched with a mixture of fascination and horror as the desacralization of their institutions accelerated, the mystery of power evaporating under the glare of flashbulbs. The tension between his crumbling private world and his public responsibilities finally exploded on February 23, 2008, at the Paris International Agricultural Show. This event is a sacred rite of passage for French politicians, a place to drink wine, pat cows, and demonstrate a connection with the rural heartland. But Sarkozy was already wounded. His poll numbers were in free fall, the bling-bling label was sticking, and he was visibly on edge. As he moved through the crushing crowd, seeking the adoration that served as his oxygen, he extended his hand to a man who recoiled and muttered, "Ah, no, don't touch me, you soil me." A secure leader, grounded in the dignity of his office, would have laughed this off or ignored it. But Nicolas Sarkozy, the boy from Neuilly, who could never handle rejection, allowed the narcissistic injury to bypass his impulse control completely. The president of the republic sneered, his face twisting into a mask of pure, street-level aggression, and hissed, "Casse-toi alors, pauvre con." "Get lost then, you poor jerk." The insult was captured on video and went viral instantly, playing on a loop across the nation. It was a catastrophe that went far beyond a simple loss of temper. It was a revelation of contempt. It shattered the illusion that the president is the father of the nation, for a father does not spit insults at his children. The incident revealed the fatal weakness of his character in high definition. He could not separate his fragile ego from the majestic office he held. An insult to Sarkozy, the man was perceived as an act of treason against the state, justifying a violent, vulgar response. From that moment on, the bond between the president and the people was severed, replaced by a mutual suspicion. He was no longer the reformer. He was the divisive, impulsive figure who had dragged the presidency down into the mud. Paranoia began to set in as the walls closed around him, feeling that the media, the judges, and even his own allies were conspiring against him. Sarkozy began to obsess over control, intervening in the nominations of public television bosses and summoning journalists to his office to berate them. Yet, in the background, a darker narrative was already being written, one that would make the bling-bling scandals seem trivial by comparison. The immense financial cost of the 2007 campaign, the lifestyle he coveted, and the debts he had incurred were rumors that refused to die. While the public focused on the yachts and the supermodels, the true cost of his ambition was buried in the sands of Libya, where a dictator was waiting to call in a favor. The Sun King of the tabloids was burning bright, but he was burning through his political capital and his moral authority at a terrifying rate, setting the stage for the corruption that would eventually consume him. But the lifestyle Sarkozy coveted, the Rolexes, the yachts, the supermodels, required resources a civil servant's salary could not provide. As he eyed the presidency, he needed a war chest of a man drunk on his own image. What happened between Paris and Tripoli was the disease itself. Every tragedy requires a fatal error in judgment, a moment where the protagonist believes he can outsmart the devil. For Nicolas Sarkozy, that devil wore Bedouin robes and sunglasses. He called the traitor back. In May 2002, Nicolas Sarkozy walked up the steps of the Hôtel de Beauvau. He was appointed Minister of the Interior, the head of the police. He had the keys to the cells. He had the keys to the safes, and most importantly, he had the keys to the secrets. The boy who was bullied was now the sheriff, and he wasn't just going to enforce the law, he was going to use the law to pave his road to the ultimate prize, the Élysée Palace. But ambition is expensive. Campaigning is expensive. And the lifestyle Sarkozy coveted, the Rolexes, the yachts, the supermodels, required resources that a civil servant's salary could not provide. As he sat in his new office looking at the files of intelligence, he knew he needed a war chest that would make him invincible. Somewhere across the Mediterranean, in a tent in the Libyan desert, a dictator was watching him. Muammar Gaddafi was looking for a friend in Europe, and Nicolas Sarkozy was looking for a financier. The stage was set for the Faustian Bargain. The wound of the child was about to become the corruption of the man. The innocent climb was over. The descent into the abyss was about to begin. The date is May 6, 2007, and France believes it is witnessing a resurrection. Nicolas Sarkozy has just been elected President of the Republic with 53% of the vote, defeating the socialist Ségolène Royal and promising a rupture with the stagnation of the past decades. To the millions who voted for him, he is the candidate of work, the man who campaigned on the slogan of the France that wakes up early, promising meritocracy and order. But as the confetti falls on the Place de la Concorde, a different reality is already taking shape behind the scenes, one that will define the catastrophic trajectory of the next 5 years. Tradition dictates that a newly elected French president celebrates with solemnity, acknowledging the burden of history by dining with his team or retreating to a quiet location to contemplate the heavy mantle of de Gaulle and Mitterrand. Nicolas Sarkozy, however, does not go to a monastery or a modest bistro. He goes to Fouquet's. This choice of venue, a legendary brasserie on the corner of the Champs-Élysées, known for its red velvet, gold leaf, and exorbitant prices, was the first fatal error of his presidency, a tactical blunder driven entirely by his psychological need for validation from the financial elite. The guest list that night did not feature the poets, philosophers, or resistance heroes that traditionally surround a French head of state. Instead, the table was populated by the titans of the CAC 40 stock index. There sat Vincent Bolloré, the media and logistics tycoon, Martin Bouygues, the construction magnate, and Bernard Arnault, the emperor of luxury goods. To the French public, who were still sweeping up the election pamphlets promising protection for the working class, this dinner was a visceral betrayal. It was a visual declaration that the new president did not belong to the voters who had elected him, but to the oligarchs who had quietly supported him. In the eyes of the electorate, the candidate of work instantly transformed into the president of the rich, stripping him of the populist armor he had spent years constructing. The damage was compounded days later when Sarkozy announced he would be taking a retreat to rest and prepare for office, leading the public to expect a secluded stay in a state residence. Instead, photographers captured him on the deck of the Paloma, a 60-meter luxury superyacht owned by Vincent Bolloré, cruising off the coast of Malta. The images were devastating in their clarity. Sarkozy in Ray-Ban aviators and designer swim trunks, laughing and sunbathing in a display of ostentatious wealth that most French citizens could not comprehend in 1,000 lifetimes. This was the birth of the bling-bling presidency, a derogatory label borrowed from American hip-hop culture that evoked the sound of heavy gold chains clashing. It suggested something cheap, loud, and fundamentally un-French. By accepting this vacation as a gift from a billionaire who relied on state contracts, Sarkozy not only blurred the ethical lines of his office, but also revealed a profound lack of empathy for the economic reality of his constituents. He was behaving like a lottery winner or a rock star, utterly blind to the fact that the French presidency is a role that demands a certain monastic detachment from material excess. However, to view these actions merely as political miscalculations is to miss the psychological tragedy unfolding beneath the gold-plated surface, the frenetic energy, the desperate need to be seen in luxury, and the manic public appearances were not just signs of arrogance. They were symptoms of a man trying to outrun a private collapse. Cecilia Sarkozy, his wife, chief strategist, and the emotional anchor of his life, was leaving him. She had been the architect of his rise, and his name was Muammar Gaddafi. The relationship between the French president and the Libyan dictator is the dark heart of this story. Faustian Bargain, where the soul of the French Republic was allegedly placed on the table as collateral for a campaign war chest. The year is 2005. Nicolas Sarkozy is the Minister of the Interior, the first cop of France. He is preparing for the battle of his life, the 2007 presidential election. In the ruthless arithmetic of French politics, charisma is necessary, but money is decisive. French electoral law is strict, imposing tight caps on spending to prevent corruption, but the machinery of a modern campaign, the rallies, the travel, the secret polls, the networks of influence, requires fuel that legal limits cannot provide. Sarkozy's ambition was a hungry beast, and it was starving. He needed an edge. He needed liquid capital that could move through the shadows, untraceable and abundant. And just across the Mediterranean, a pariah state was looking to buy its way back into civilization. Muammar Gaddafi, the guide of the revolution, had been isolated for decades, branded a terrorist and a madman by the West. But Gaddafi was a survivor, and he understood the cynical language of power better than anyone. He sat on a throne of oil and cash, billions of dollars frozen or hidden, and he possessed a desperate desire to pitch his tent in the capitals of Europe, to be treated as a statesman rather than a monster. He saw in Nicolas Sarkozy, the rising star, the ambitious outsider, the man in a hurry, a perfect vessel for his rehabilitation. It was a transaction of grotesque simplicity. Gaddafi had the money, and Sarkozy had the keys to the West. The architect of this alleged pact was not a diplomat, but a fixer. Enter Ziad Taqiyuddin, a Franco-Lebanese arms dealer with the smooth manner of a viper and a contact book filled with the names of the powerful and the corrupt. According to Taqiyuddin's later sworn testimony that would become the cornerstone of the judicial nightmare consuming Sarkozy today, the deal was struck in secret meetings in Tripoli. The narrative he provided to judges is cinematic in its detail. He described the heavy leather suitcases, the kind used for diplomatic transport, packed tight with bundles of 200 and 500 euro notes. He described the smell of the cash, the weight of it in his hands as he transported it from the Libyan Secret Service headquarters to Paris. These were not bank transfers that leave a digital footprint. This was the raw physical currency of corruption. Taqiyuddin alleged that between late 2006 and early 2007, he made 3 trips, delivering a total of 5 million euros in cash directly to the Ministry of the Interior at the Place Beauvau. He described walking into the private office of Claude Guéant, Sarkozy's right-hand man and chief of staff, and leaving the cases. On one occasion, he claimed Nicolas Sarkozy himself was present, greeting him with the knowing smile of a co-conspirator. The total amount funneled from the Libyan regime to the Sarkozy campaign, according to documents later uncovered by the investigative journal Mediapart, was allegedly as high as 50 million euros. Whether the figure was 5 million or 50 million is a matter for the courts, but the political reality is undeniable. Immediately after his election in 2007, Nicolas Sarkozy initiated a diplomatic pivot so violent it induced whiplash in the French foreign ministry. He didn't just normalize relations with Libya, he rolled out the red carpet. This culminated in December 2007 in one of the most surreal and humiliating spectacles in the history of the Fifth Republic. Muammar Gaddafi came to Paris for a state visit. The visit was a hallucination. Sarkozy, the man who had campaigned on human rights and the dignity of France, allowed a dictator to pitch a heated Bedouin tent in the gardens of the Hôtel de Marigny, mere meters from the presidential palace. Gaddafi treated Paris like a conquered province. He demanded to be driven through the streets in a white stretch limousine. He insulted French ministers. He gave rambling lectures on history. The French political class was horrified. Sarkozy's own Secretary of State for Human Rights, Rama Yade, expressed her disgust, noting that France was not a doormat on which a dictator could wipe his feet of blood. But Sarkozy stood by him. He stood on the steps of the Élysée, shaking Gaddafi's hand, smiling that tight, aggressive smile. Why? Why endure such public humiliation? Why alienate his allies and shock the public? The only logical answer is that this was not diplomacy. It was a debt repayment. Sarkozy was not hosting a head of state. He was hosting his creditor. The bling-bling lifestyle, the massive rallies, the polished media machine. It was all arguably underpinned by the petrodollars of a tyrant. This was the moment the power corruption became total. Sarkozy had compromised the sovereignty of France to service his own ambition. He believed he could control Gaddafi, that he could take the money, give the dictator a few photo ops, and then manage him like a junior minister. This is the classic error of the narcissist, the belief that they are the only player in the game who has agency. Sarkozy thought he was the puppet master, but in reality, he had tied himself to a ticking time bomb. Gaddafi was not a fool. He was a predator who kept receipts. He recorded conversations. He kept notebooks. He knew that owning the president of France was his ultimate insurance policy against the West. But Sarkozy, blinded by his own grandiosity, failed to see the trap. He thought he had committed the perfect crime, a victimless transaction in the desert. He did not realize that by accepting the devil's gold, he had given Muammar Gaddafi the power to destroy him. The tragedy of this chapter is not just legal, it is moral. It represents the complete erosion of the values Sarkozy claimed to champion. The law and order candidate, the man who called the youth of the suburbs scum for burning cars, was allegedly burning the very integrity of the French democracy in secret backrooms. He had traded the dignity of the republic for a suitcase of bills. As the visit ended and Gaddafi's limousine convoy headed back to the airport, Sarkozy likely breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the debt was paid. He could not have known that 4 years later, the desert wind would shift, and the secrets buried in that tent would rise up to bury him. The Faustian Bargain was concluded, but Mephistopheles always comes back to collect the soul. If the first year of the presidency was a manic carnival of lights, noise, and blinding camera flashes, the middle years were defined by a suffocating, creeping darkness. By late 2008, the hyper-president had mutated. The kinetic energy that once electrified the nation and promised a rupture with the past had curdled into a frantic, paranoid restlessness. The Élysée Palace, historically designed to be the transparent house of the people, had transformed into a bunker. Inside, the air was thin, recycled and poisonous. Nicolas Sarkozy was no longer governing. He was warring. He was at war with the global financial crisis that had shattered his economic promises. He was at war with his plummeting poll numbers, which gnawed at his self-worth. He was at war with a press corps that had ceased to be charmed by his antics. And ultimately, he was at war with a reality he could no longer control. To understand the pathology of this specific period, the years of the manipulator, we must first understand the ecosystem of fear Nicolas Sarkozy cultivated around himself. A narcissist in power does not build a team of equals. He builds a court of dependence. And in the court of Nicolas Sarkozy, The only currency that held value was absolute submission. The colère de Sarkozy, the president's legendary volcanic rages, became the weather patterns by which his staff navigated their days. Ministers, men and women of high standing and long careers, would enter his office and be reduced to trembling schoolchildren. He would scream, he would insult, he would physically intimidate, invading their personal space with a violence that was shocking in the hushed halls of the Republic. This was not merely a management style, it was a psychological mechanism. By breaking the wills of those around him, by keeping his advisors in a permanent state of anxiety and adrenaline, he ensured that no one would dare hold up a mirror to his failures. He created a vacuum of truth, and in that vacuum, a dangerous delusion began to grow. The belief that he could manipulate the perception of reality itself, that if he controlled the image, the substance did not matter. Into this vacuum stepped the architect of the darkness, Patrick Bismuth. If Sarkozy was the king, Bismuth was his Rasputin, a figure who seemed to emerge from the shadows of a different era. A former journalist for the far-right newspaper Minuti, a historian with a nostalgia for the reactionary past and the colonial empire, Bismuth was an anomaly in the modern technocratic world of the Élysée. He did not wear the polished suits of the anarchists. He wore the rumpled look of a conspirator. He whispered into the president's ear exactly what his fragile ego, bruised by the bling-bling backlash, was desperate to hear. The world is against you because you are right. The liberals, the judges, the immigrants, the media, they are the enemies of the true France. You do not need to compromise with them. You need to crush them. Bismuth did not just offer political advice. He offered a methodology of manipulation that would lead to one of the most grotesque scandals of the presidency, the polls affair, l'affaire des sondages. In a healthy democracy, opinion polls are navigational tools used to gauge the public mood on policy issues like retirement age or health care. For Nicolas Sarkozy, they were a mirror. He needed to look at them every morning to confirm he existed, to confirm he was loved, or at least feared. Under Bismuth's malign influence, the Élysée began ordering polls at an industrial, almost pathological scale. But these were not standard inquiries into the state of the nation. They were obsessive, granular interrogations of the president's image. Do they love me? Do they think I am tall? Do they like Carla? Is she more popular than me? How do I compare to Napoleon? The corruption lay in the mechanism of this vanity. The Élysée, in flagrant violation of public procurement laws, signed lucrative contracts with Bismuth's own consulting firm, Publifact, without a public tender. Millions of euros of taxpayer money were funneled into Bismuth's accounts to pay for these vanity metrics. It was a closed loop of narcissism. The public paid for the president to ask the public if they liked him, but it went deeper. Bismuth would allegedly cherry-pick the data, presenting the president with a sanitized, optimized version of reality to keep his mood stable, while charging the state a fortune for the service. It was the monetization of the president's insecurity. Sarkozy was paying a fortune to be lied to, using the money of the people he was failing to serve, turning the machinery of the state into a therapy session for one man. But controlling the internal data was not enough. The manipulator needed to control the external narrative. Sarkozy viewed the media not as a pillar of democracy, nor as a watchdog, but as a subordinate branch of his administration. His relationship with the press was abusive, oscillating between seductive charm and brutal intimidation. He treated the owners of France's major media conglomerates, Martin Bouygues, Arnaud Lagardère, Vincent Bolloré, not as independent tycoons but as his lieutenants. These were the men he dined with at Fouquet's. They were the godfathers to his children, his vacation hosts. He believed their friendship gave him editorial rights over their networks. The defenestration of Patrick Poivre d'Arvor, known to the French simply as PPDA, is the defining casualty of this war on the press. PPDA was not just a journalist, he was a monarch of the airwaves. For decades, he had anchored the 8 p.m. news on TF1, the most watched news program in Europe. He was an institution, a man whose voice ushered the French people through history. But he was irreverent. He had dared to compare Sarkozy to a little boy during an interview at the G8 summit, commenting on the president's fidgety, excited demeanor. He had refused to bow to the hyper-president. In 2008, PPDA was fired. The official reason given by the network was modernization and a need for a change of generation. The real reason, whispered in every newsroom and salon in Paris, was that the president had demanded his head on a platter. Sarkozy wanted a cleaner, friendlier screen. He wanted news anchors who would nod, not question. He replaced the difficult intellectual figures with more pliable faces. The message sent to the press corps was chilling. If the king of the news can be executed for a slight, none of you are safe. Sarkozy's obsession with control extended to the microscopic details of coverage. He would call television executives in the middle of the night, screaming about a headline, a camera angle, or the tone of a report. Imagine the scene. The president of a G7 nation, at 2 a.m., red-faced, veins bulging, screaming into a telephone because a reporter mentioned his declining popularity or filmed him from an unflattering angle. It is the behavior of a tyrant in a banana republic, not the leader of the land of the Enlightenment. It showed a man whose skin was so thin that every critique felt like a physical assault. A man who believed that if he could just scream loud enough, he could force the country to see him as the hero he believed himself to be. Paranoia, however, is a hungry beast. It has no bottom. When you control the press and the polls, and the people still whisper, you begin to fear the whispers. You begin to hunt for the sources. You begin to see enemies in your own shadow. In 2010, the manipulator crossed the final red line, the line that separates a democracy from a police state. He turned the intelligence apparatus of the nation against its own citizens. This is the Fadettes affair, l'affaire des Fadettes. Investigative journalists at Le Monde, the paper of record, the guardian of French intellectual life, were digging into the Bettencourt scandal. This was a complex, sprawling web of allegations involving Liliane Bettencourt, the heiress to the L'Oréal fortune and the richest woman in France. The stories were damaging. They hinted at tax evasion, at Swiss bank accounts, and crucially, at envelopes of cash allegedly destined for the Sarkozy campaign, handed over by the senile billionaire to politicians in her drawing room. The stories in Le Monde contained details that could only have come from inside the judicial investigation. Someone was leaking. Someone inside the machinery of justice was talking to the press. Sarkozy was furious. He did not see this as the press doing its job. He saw it as treason. He summoned Bernard Squarcini, the head of the DCRI, the Central Directorate of Interior Intelligence. Squarcini, known as the Shark, was the spy master of France. But more importantly, he was a Sarkozy loyalist, a man who owed his entire career to the president. Sarkozy gave the order, implicit or explicit, but the intent was clear: find the source, kill the leak, protect the president. Squarcini did not obtain a warrant from a judge. He did not follow due process. He utilized the counterterrorism capabilities of the French intelligence service tools designed to hunt al-Qaeda cells and prevent massacres, to spy on the journalists of Le Monde. They accessed the detailed phone records, vedettes, of the reporters to triangulate their movements and their contacts. They mapped the network of calls. They identified the whistleblower, a senior official in the Ministry of Justice named David Sena, and they purged him, sending him to a penal colony of bureaucracy in French Guiana. Let the gravity of this sink in. The state spy agency funded by the taxpayer to protect the nation from terrorism was deployed as a private plumbing service to fix a leak that threatened the president's political reputation. It was a violation of the freedom of the press and the sanctity of sources so egregious that it recalled the dark days of the Nixon presidency. It was Watergate, French style. But unlike Nixon, Sarkozy did not operate in the shadows. He operated with the arrogance of a man who believed he was the law. He had fused his person with the state. To investigate Sarkozy was to attack France. Therefore, using the state's spies to defend Sarkozy was, in his twisted logic, an act of patriotism. But while the manipulator was watching the journalists, and the spies were watching the phones, and the advisors were massaging the polls, a silent observer was recording the truth right under the noses of the elite. The irony of history is that the greatest threat to Sarkozy did not come from a grand conspiracy, but from a butler with a dictaphone. In the mansion of Liliane Bettencourt in Neuilly, that same neighborhood where Sarkozy had begun his ascent, the butler, Pascal Bonnefoy, was tired. He was tired of watching his mistress, an elderly woman slipping into dementia, being exploited by the sharks circling her fortune. He watched as photographers, artists, and politicians paraded through the salon, flattering her, taking her money, and leaving. He decided to act. He bought a simple digital recorder. He hid it on the silver serving tray under a napkin. He hid it on the Louis XV desk, and he pressed record. The Bettencourt tapes would become the soundtrack of Sarkozy's nightmare. They captured intimate, unguarded conversations about tax evasion, about hiding islands in the Seychelles, about secret accounts in Switzerland. But crucially, they captured the voice of Patrice de Maistre, Bettencourt's wealth manager, boasting about his connections to Eric Wirth, Sarkozy's treasurer and minister of labor. De Maistre spoke of giving money to politicians, of the need to stay on the good side of the president, of the transactionality of power. The tapes revealed a world of casual, rotting corruption, a world where money was moved in envelopes like in a mafia movie, where ministers were treated as employees of the billionaires, and where the president was the ultimate guarantor of the system. When these tapes leaked in mid-2010, published by the fearless website Mediapart, the bunker of the Élysée began to shake. The reality that Sarkozy had tried so hard to manipulate, to polish, to suppress, came crashing in through the windows. His response was predictable: attack, deny, destroy. He claimed it was a plot. He claimed the butler was an agent of the left. He claimed the journalists were fascists. He claimed the judges were biased. But the facade was cracking. The manipulator was losing his grip. He was pulling levers, screaming orders, demanding loyalty, but the machine was no longer responding. The public looked at the polls, the real ones, not the ones bought by Bismuth, and saw a president who was drowning in scandal. The hyper-president had become the toxic president. And in the distance, far beyond the salons of Neuilly, the ghosts of Libya were beginning to stir. The Arab Spring was approaching on the horizon like a sandstorm. The dictator Sarkozy had embraced in 2007 was about to face a revolution, and the secrets they shared, the secrets of the suitcases, the cash, and the compromised election were about to become the most dangerous currency on earth. The stage was set for the ultimate act of violence, a war launched not for the liberation of a people, but for the silencing of a past. The manipulator had run out of tricks. Now he would need to use force. From corruption and fragility, the story now descended into the realm of Greek tragedy, where the sins of the past demanded payment in blood. The year is 2011. The Arab Spring is sweeping across the Middle East like a wildfire, toppling dictators who had sat on their thrones for decades. In Tunisia, Ben Ali falls. In Egypt, Mubarak falls. And in Libya, the people rise up against the brother leader, Muammar Gaddafi. For Nicolas Sarkozy, sitting in the Élysée Palace with approval ratings at historic lows and a re-election campaign looming, this geopolitical earthquake presents a terrifying paradox. On one hand, it is an opportunity to play the hero, to reclaim the mantle of the statesman by supporting democracy. On the other hand, the revolution in Tripoli threatens to crack open the vault of his darkest secrets. The man he had embraced in 2007, the man whose money had allegedly fueled his rise, was now cornered. And a cornered beast does not negotiate, it bites. The turning point, the moment the Faustian Bargain turned into a death warrant, occurred in March 2011. As the rebels in Benghazi faced imminent annihilation by Gaddafi's tanks, the dictator's son, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, sat down for an interview with Euronews. Saif was the polished face of the regime, the man who had facilitated the secret deals in the hotels of Paris. He looked into the camera, his face twisted with the realization of French betrayal, and he pulled the pin on the grenade. He demanded that Sarkozy give back the money. He stated with chilling specificity, Sarkozy must first give back the money he took from Libya to finance his electoral campaign. We financed his campaign and we have the proof. We are ready to reveal everything. The first thing we ask this clown to do is to give the money back to the Libyan people. It was blackmail broadcast to the world. It was blackmail broadcast to the world. For Sarkozy, the narcissistic injury was immediate, but the political threat was existential. If Gaddafi produced the receipts, the recordings, the bank transfer documents, the testimony of the couriers, Sarkozy's presidency would not just end. He would likely face prison. The primal wound of the humiliated child would be reopened for the entire world to see. A rational leader might have sought a diplomatic exit, a negotiated exile for Gaddafi to silence him. But Nicolas Sarkozy, the man of the casse-toi pauvre con, the man of impulse and action, chose a different path. He chose total eradication. Almost overnight, the French president transformed from Gaddafi's partner into his executioner. It was a pivot so violent and absolute that it stunned the international community. Sarkozy became the most hawkish voice in the West, pushing the United Nations, dragging a reluctant Barack Obama, and bullying the European Union into a military intervention. He championed UN Resolution 1973, authorizing all necessary measures to protect civilians. Was this truly about saving the people of Benghazi, or was the humanitarian mandate a convenient cover for a cleanup operation? Or was the humanitarian mandate a convenient cover for a cleanup operation? Was the goal regime change, or was it the physical elimination of the primary witness to the grand corruption of 2007? The war began on March 19, 2011. Appropriately, it was a French Rafale jet that dropped the first bomb, destroying a Libyan tank column. Sarkozy was the commander-in-chief, finally playing the role he had always coveted, the war leader, the Napoleon of the 21st century. He basked in the visuals of airstrikes, using the conflict to distract the French public from his domestic failures. He sent the philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy to the front lines as his envoy, turning the war into a media spectacle, a grand moral crusade. But while the cameras focused on the liberation of towns, the French intelligence services were operating in the shadows. The DGSE, Directorate General for External Security, had boots on the ground, embedding with the rebels, directing the airstrikes, and hunting for the brother leader. The climax of this operatic fratricide arrived on October 20th, 2011. Muammar Gaddafi, the man who had ruled for 42 years, the man who had pitched his tent in the gardens of Paris, was fleeing his hometown of Sirte. He was in a convoy of heavy vehicles, trying to escape the rebel encirclement. He was alive. He was a captive source of information. He was a witness, but he never made it out of the desert. It was a French Mirage jet that delivered the critical strike. The aircraft bombed the convoy, stopping the vehicles in a twisted wreck of fire and metal. Gaddafi, wounded and dazed, crawled into a drainage pipe under the road, a rat caught in a trap. He was dragged out by a mob of rebels. The images of his final moments are among the most brutal ever captured in the age of the smartphone. He was beaten, sodomized with a bayonet, and paraded on the hood of a truck. But amidst the chaos of the lynching, there are persistent dark whispers, theories supported by Libyan officials and intelligence sources, that the fatal shot, the bullet to the head that finally silenced him, was not fired by a rebel acting in rage, but by a French agent infiltrated into the mob. This is the coup de grace theory. Rami El Obeidi, the former head of foreign intelligence for the Libyan Transitional Council, explicitly stated that French intelligence located Gaddafi by tracking his satellite phone, and that the priority was to ensure he never stood trial. Why? Because a trial at The Hague would have given Gaddafi a microphone. And if Gaddafi had a microphone, he would have talked about the suitcases. He would have talked about 2007. He would have talked about Nicolas Sarkozy. By ensuring Gaddafi died in the dust of Sirte, the threat was neutralized. The witness was eliminated. The Faustian Bargain was concluded with a bullet. Sarkozy reacted to the news of Gaddafi's death with a statement of grim satisfaction, framing it as a victory for democracy. The Libyan people have been liberated, he declared, but the liberation was a mirage. In the vacuum left by the dictator, Libya collapsed into anarchy. Warlords, Islamists, and human traffickers carved up the country. The statesman's war created a failed state on Europe's doorstep, triggering a migration crisis that would destabilize the continent for a decade. But for Sarkozy, in that immediate moment, the mission was accomplished. The voice that threatened to expose him was silent. The notebooks were lost in the looting. The secrets were buried under the sand. However, the detective knows that blood is sticky. It does not wash away easily. Sarkozy believed he had severed the link, but the violence of the act only drew more attention to the motive. The execution of Gaddafi did not end the investigation. It fueled it. Judges in Paris began to ask, why was the president so desperate to kill his former friend? The death of the dictator transformed the financial scandal into a blood crime. It added a layer of macabre tragedy to the corruption. Sarkozy had used the might of the French military, the heroism of its pilots, and the moral authority of the UN to settle a personal debt. It was the ultimate abuse of power, the privatization of war. As 2011 turned to 2012, the adrenaline of the conflict faded, and the grim reality returned. Sarkozy was no longer the hero of Benghazi. He was just an unpopular president facing a re-election battle he was destined to lose. The ghosts of the desert were not gone. They were merely waiting. Ziad Taqiyuddin was still alive. The former Libyan officials who survived the purge were in hiding, holding on to their documents. The collapse was not averted. It was merely postponed. Sarkozy had bought himself silence, but he had paid for it with the soul of his presidency. He stood atop a pile of rubble proclaiming victory while the foundations of his own house were rotting away. The bill for the suitcases was still due, and Nemesis was coming to collect. The fall from power is not a slow descent, it is a cliff. On May 15, 2012, Nicolas Sarkozy ceased to be the president of the French Republic. In that instant, he lost the nuclear codes, he lost the adoration of the crowds, but most dangerously, he lost his immunity. For 5 years, the Constitution had shielded him from the judges who were quietly building their dossiers in the dimly lit offices of the Financial Crimes Division. Now, the shield was gone. Sarkozy was just a citizen again, Citizen Sarkozy. But he was a citizen with a target on his back and a history of cutting corners that was about to catch up with him. The psychological impact of this transition cannot be overstated. For a man fueled by grandiosity, the sudden silence of the telephone is a form of death. Sarkozy retreated to his wife's mansion, bitter and restless. He believed he had been rejected by an ungrateful nation. But his paranoia, that old companion from the Interior Ministry, told him that the war was not over. He was convinced that the socialist government and the red judges, leftist magistrates, were conspiring to imprison him. This belief, whether true or delusional, drove him to make a catastrophic error. He decided to stop acting like a former statesman and start acting like a fugitive. The investigators, led by the relentless Serge Tournaire, were digging into the Libyan financing accusations. They made a bold, unprecedented move. They wiretapped the personal phone of the former president. It was a violation of privacy that enraged Sarkozy's camp, but it was legal. They were listening for evidence of Libyan cash. Instead, they stumbled upon a completely different crime, a crime born of pure panic. In late 2013, the police, listening to the official line of Nicolas Sarkozy, noticed something strange. The line was dead. Sarkozy, a man who lived on the phone, a man who could not go 5 minutes without talking, had suddenly stopped communicating on his main number. The investigators realized he had gone dark. He had been tipped off. The reality was far more pathetic and incriminating. Sarkozy, the former head of the G7, the man who had commanded armies, had sent his lawyer Thierry Herzog to a tobacconist shop in Nice to buy a prepaid SIM card under a false name. It is the tradecraft of a drug dealer, not a president. The name chosen for the account was Paul Bismuth, actually the name of an old high school friend of the lawyer. Sarkozy and Herzog believed this burner line was secure. They believed they were invisible. They began to talk freely. And on the other end of the line, the police were recording every word. The Paul Bismuth tapes are the smoking gun of Sarkozy's moral collapse. They do not reveal a man worried about the state of the nation. They reveal a man obsessed with obstructing justice. The conversations focused on a high-ranking magistrate at the Court of Cassation named Gilbert Azibert. Azibert was a senior judge, a man near the end of his career, but he held a key position. He had access to confidential files regarding the Betancourt investigation, specifically whether the police could legally use the secret diaries seized from Sarkozy's calendar. Sarkozy needed those diaries buried. If the judges saw them, they might find the links to the illegal cash. The transaction caught on tape was a classic quid pro quo, corruption in its purest, most transactional form. Sarkozy and his lawyer discussed asking Azibert to breach his professional secrecy, to influence his fellow judges, and to leak confidential information to Sarkozy's team. In exchange, Sarkozy would use his remaining influence to secure a prestigious retirement post for Azibert in Monaco. Listen to the banality of the evil. Sarkozy: I will help him. Moi je le fais monter. Herzog: he served us well. He served us well. They were speaking about a senior judge as if he were a corrupt cop on a payroll. The tapes revealed a clan mentality. Sarkozy was the godfather, dispensing favors, demanding loyalty, manipulating the highest court in the land to save his own skin. But beyond the corruption, the tapes revealed the panic. Sarkozy sounded desperate. He sounded like a man who knew the walls were closing in. The hyper-president had been reduced to whispering on a burner phone, terrified of his own shadow. The fatal weakness, the inability to accept the rules that apply to others, had led him into a trap of his own making. He believed he was smarter than the system. He believed Paul Bismuth was a clever disguise. In reality, it was a confession of guilt. Innocent men do not use fake identities to talk to their lawyers. The climax of this chapter is a moment of historic humiliation. On July 1st, 2014, the unthinkable happened. Nicolas Sarkozy became the first former president in the history of France to be placed in garde à vue, police custody. He was summoned to the anti-corruption office in Nanterre. He was detained for 15 hours. He was interrogated in a small windowless room, just like a common thief. For a man whose entire life was built on the projection of status, this was a psychological annihilation. He was forced to answer questions about Paul Bismuth. He was forced to listen to his own voice on the tapes. When he emerged, he was indicted for active corruption and influence peddling. He went on television that night to defend himself, but the magic was gone. He looked tired. He looked angry. He ranted about a political plot comparing the French judiciary to the Stasi of East Germany. It was the narcissistic rage flaring up again, but this time it looked pathetic rather than powerful. He tried to frame himself as the victim of a cabal, but the public had heard the name Paul Bismuth. They understood the implication. The narrative of the strong man was shattered. A strong man faces his accusers. A guilty man hides behind a fake name at a tobacconist's counter. This period marked the definitive end of Sarkozy's hopes for a glorious return. He would try to run again in 2016, but the Paul Bismuth affair hung around his neck like a millstone. He had exposed the dark machinery of his operation. He had shown that he viewed the Republic's institutions, the police, the courts, the judges, as obstacles to be circumvented, bought, or intimidated. The panic had driven him to commit a crime that was easier to prove than the Libyan financing. The Libyan case was complex, involving dead dictators and international spies. The Bismuth case was simple: a phone, a fake name, and a promise of a job in Monaco. It was the crime of a small-time crook committed by a man who had once shaken hands with Obama and Putin. As 2014 ended, Sarkozy was no longer just a divisive politician. He was a defendant. The legal meat grinder had started to turn, and it would not stop until it had consumed what was left of his reputation. The collapse was now entering its final phase, the judgment. If the Libyan affair was a cold geopolitical thriller, and the Paul Bismuth wiretaps were a gritty noir, the final act of Sarkozy's legal destruction is a story of pure, unadulterated greed. Not greed for money, but greed for adoration. The scandal that would finally nail the coffin shut on his political career is known as the Bygmalion affair. It is the story of a campaign that went off the rails, a runaway train fueled by a candidate who refused to accept the reality of his own unpopularity. In 2012, facing the socialist François Hollande, Nicolas Sarkozy was fighting for his life. He believed that if he could just speak louder, hold bigger rallies, and occupy more space, he could force the French people to love him again. French electoral law is strict. To ensure fairness, campaign spending is capped at 22.5 million euros. It is a line in the sand designed to prevent democracy from being bought. But Nicolas Sarkozy's ego could not fit within 22.5 million euros. He demanded a spectacle. He wanted Hollywood production values. He wanted the best lighting, the best sound, the biggest stadiums. His campaign director later described a candidate in a state of manic denial, demanding more events, more travel, more noise. The meter was running, and the limit was breached within weeks. A rational team would have hit the brakes. Sarkozy's team hit the gas and hid the speedometer. To cover up the massive overspending, which eventually reached nearly 43 million euros, almost double the legal limit, the campaign team in the event planning company, Bygmalion, created a system of industrial-scale fraud. They invented a parallel reality of fake invoices. Bygmalion billed Sarkozy's party, the UMP, for fictitious conventions that never took place, while the money was actually paying for the president's lavish rallies. It was a Ponzi scheme of political enthusiasm. This was the ultimate manifestation of narcissistic entitlement. Sarkozy believed that the rules of democracy were inconvenient obstacles to his destiny. He felt entitled to outspend his opponent because he believed he was France. The revelation of this fraud did not come from a police raid, but from a televised breakdown. In May 2014, Jérôme Lavrieux, the deputy campaign manager, sat on a news set, tears streaming down his face, and confessed. "There was a spiral," he sobbed. "We couldn't stop." Sarkozy's defense was consistent with his psychological profile, denial and victimhood. He claimed he knew nothing. He claimed he was the president of the republic, too busy saving the world to look at invoices for lighting rigs. He threw his subordinates under the bus, but the judges didn't buy it. They looked at the schedule. They looked at the man who was known as a control freak, the man who checked the height of his podiums and the camera angles of his interviews. The idea that this micromanager did not notice he was spending double the legal limit was legally implausible. The slow grinding wheels of justice finally caught up with the hyper-president in 2021. It was a year of judicial annihilation. First came the verdict in the Paul Bismuth wiretapping case. The judge, in a monotonous, clinical voice, read the sentence: 3 years in prison, 2 suspended. Found guilty of corruption and influence peddling. The shock wave was seismic. For the first time in the history of the Fifth Republic, a former president was sentenced to a custodial term. The untouchable had been touched, but the humiliation was specific. The judge ruled that the 1 year of prison could be served under house arrest with an electronic monitoring bracelet. The electronic bracelet became the ultimate symbol of the collapse. Nicolas Sarkozy, the man of perpetual motion, the man who jogged through the Bois de Boulogne, the man who flew to Libya and New York on a whim, was now tethered by a GPS tracker like a common delinquent. The bracelet was a physical manifestation of the law he had tried to outrun. It was the nemesis clamping down on his ankle. Then, months later, the verdict for the Bygmalion affair arrived. Guilty again. Another year of prison. The judge stated that Sarkozy had voluntarily skipped the controls, that he had prioritized his unrestrained quest for re-election over the law. Sarkozy appealed, of course. He fought with the ferocity of a trapped animal, railing against the injustice, vowing to go to the European Court of Human Rights. But the damage was done. The aura of invincibility was gone. The Sarkozy myth, the idea of the energetic savior, was replaced by the reality of the Sarkozy file, a stack of criminal records detailing fraud, corruption, and abuse of power. This brings us to the final assessment of his legacy. Nicolas Sarkozy is indeed France's most divisive president, but not just because of his policies. He is divisive because he shattered the moral consensus of the right. In his desperate attempt to win, he adopted the language of the far right, blurring the lines between the Republican conservatives and the National Front. He validated the politics of fear and identity, paving the way for the rise of Marine Le Pen. He broke the traditional cordon sanitaire that held French politics together. Furthermore, his moral collapse left his own party, Les Républicains, in ruins. He bankrupted the party not just financially, with the Bygmalion debt, but ideologically. He left behind a scorched earth where no air could grow. The irony is that his true successor was not a disciple, but a parasite, Emmanuel Macron. Macron, the young, brilliant outsider, swept in to take the throne by playing a polished intellectual version of Sarkozy's disruption, effectively killing the father figure to claim the crown. Sarkozy's tragedy is that he wanted to be de Gaulle, a man of history, but he ended up as a character from a Balzac novel, a man consumed by ambition, debt, and the illusions of the capital. He wanted to be loved for his strength, but he is remembered for his weakness. The fatal weakness was his inability to find worth within himself. He needed the mirror of the presidency to feel alive, and when he broke the law to keep that mirror, he shattered his own reflection forever. The story of Nicolas Sarkozy is a warning. It is a demonstration of what happens when a leader's psychology is not checked by strong institutions. It shows that charisma is not character, that energy is not competence, and that in a democracy, no man is tall enough to stand above the law. The collapse is complete. The dust has settled, and all that remains in the silence is the ghost of what could have been. The story of Nicolas Sarkozy is not merely a chronicle of political scandals. It is a modern tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. It is the story of a man who spent his entire life running away from a childhood humiliation only to run straight into a prison sentence. The ancient Greeks warned of hubris, the dangerous pride that blinds a man to his own limitations. Sarkozy's hubris was not that he wanted to be great. It was that he believed he was exempt. He believed that his energy, his speed, and his sheer force of will could bend the laws of physics and the laws of the Republic. He thought he could take money from a dictator and wash it clean. He thought he could wiretap his way out of trouble. He thought he could buy popularity with fake invoices. In the end, the primal wound, that deep aching need to be recognized by the elite who rejected him, became his fatal weakness. It drove him to seek validation in the glittering lights of Fouquet's, in the luxury of yachts, and in the dangerous embrace of tyrants. He wanted to be the hyper-president, the man who was everywhere and did everything. Instead, he became the divisive president, the man who turned the state into a mirror for his own ego and cracked it in the process. His legacy is a paradox. He was the most talented politician of his generation, a man of undeniable physical courage and tactical brilliance. Yet, he leaves behind a landscape of ruin. He fractured the French right, opening the door to the extremes. He degraded the solemnity of the presidency, turning it into a reality show of private drama and public rage. And most damningly, he compromised the moral standing of France on the world stage, leaving the shadow of the Libyan intervention to haunt the conscience of the West. Today, Nicolas Sarkozy wanders the periphery of power, a king in exile, whispering advice to successors who listen politely but keep their distance. He writes books that sell by the truckload, seeking in the pages of his memoirs the vindication the courts have denied him. But history is a ruthless editor. It will not remember the reforms or the speeches. It will remember the casse-toi. It will remember the bling-bling. It will remember the Paul Bismuth phone line. And it will remember the silence of the Libyan desert. The collapse of Nicolas Sarkozy serves as a monumental warning to democracies everywhere. It reminds us that character is destiny. It reminds us that when we elect a leader who is governed by insecurity and driven by narcissism, we do not get a savior, we get a wreckage. The boy from Neuilly finally conquered the world, but in his desperate struggle to stay on top, he forgot the most important lesson of all. The higher you climb on a ladder built of lies, the harder the fall.